You know that movie where a scientist that nobody has much faith in is vindicated by discovering aliens and making transcendental contact with them? No, not Arrival, not The Departed, not Close Encounters of the Third Kind, not The Fourth Kind, but Contact, not the song by Daft Punk. If anybody cracked the code for lovable 1990s blockbusters, it's Steven Spielberg, but also Robert Zemeckis. In a couple of months, his new film, Here, is going to come out, starring Tom Hanks and Robin Wright, the people from Forrest Gump, and co-written with Eric Roth, the guy who co-wrote Forrest Gump, a movie so nice they're making it twice, or three times if you count being there. Contact was Zemeckis' follow-up to Forrest Gump, and it has some of the same magic. But what if we set nostalgia aside? Is this actually a good movie? Is it more than a formulaic family movie? Do its more ambitious elements amount to anything? And is there any chance that a curmudgeon like me would enjoy this movie? Contact starts out like someone's final project for screenwriting 101. Within the first 10 minutes, we have a good guy, the scientist Ellie Arroway, played by Jodie Foster. Ellie has a scrappy gang of diverse sidekicks. There's a love interest, a wanderlust preacher, played by Matthew McConaughey. What's his name? Palmer Joss. Now, if ever there were a name from a movie, that would be it. There's a bad guy, the head of the National Science Foundation or something like that. This is David Drumlin, played by Tom Skerritt. I wouldn't really have expected a prominent scientist to be the bad guy, but we'll come back to that in a little bit. To me, the beginning of this movie is pretty clunky, but in some ways, Contact is more subtle than I had expected. You just have to wait a little bit. Before we join up with Jodie Foster and Matthew McConaughey, we get to meet young Ellie, a ham radio enthusiast. This movie has a few flashbacks showing Ellie growing up in Nostalgiaville. Her childhood home reminds me of the one on the cover of the album American Football, the first one, you know the one. These scenes are a mixed bag, these flashbacks have their ups and downs. There's some decent writing. I sort of buy Ellie spending her childhood trying to contact people on the radio and how that would set her future in motion. The film is pointing to a theme I like here, which is that there's some kind of spiritual interconnectedness coming in on the radio. There are other movies that allude to this too, like Three Colors Red or Videodrome, maybe. I've never been into ham radio, but I do have a software-defined radio that I sometimes use to sweep through the chatter. It's sitting right over there, actually. If you do this in New York City, you mainly realize that there are a lot of crimes being committed at all times. Amateur radio is more profound than you might expect, though, and I think they tap into that a little bit in this movie. There are some nice details in this childhood section. For instance, Ellie is drawing a picture at one point, and she puts the paper on top of a board game box, so she has something to write on. That rings true to me. They even dig up a period-correct board game for it, too. I remember when I was a kid, I had certain books on my shelf that only ever saw service as tables, essentially. Other things here don't quite add up. For instance, Ellie seems to be this precocious child. Her father is always gently quizzing her, giving her hints, rather than revealing the answers when she's stumped. And yet, she asks if they can use the radio to contact her dead mother. Foolish, but I appreciate the sentiment. These scenes are heavy-handed. Ellie's mother is deceased, and before too long, her father dies too. I'm going to spoil a couple of minor things in this movie, but to be honest, if you read the tiny little blurb on IMDb, it spoils a large portion of the film as well. What are you going to do? This, the deaths of both parents maybe alludes to another theme in the movie of loneliness and contact, but for me, it felt like a little bit too much. Of course, you might also wonder why any of these scenes are in the movie at all. A couple of these flashbacks seem truly useless, at least until you get to the very end of the movie. I'm dwelling on the beginning a little bit here because I think that this actually describes most of the movie. Some nice details, some interesting themes, but cheesy and not particularly rigorous. I'm not sure what else I was expecting. One of the interesting things about Contact is that it's sort of a movie for scientists and nerds, but it's also a movie that scientists and nerds might not like at all. You have to give Contact some credit for putting science at the center. The movie kicks off in Puerto Rico at the Arecibo telescope, and it's not there to be the background of a fight like it is in James Bond. We're going to see some actual science happening, and it's kind of believable. Maybe they're focusing a little bit on an aesthetics of science, big telescopes, cool-looking computers, but still, this could be inspiring. There's an enormous irony to all of this, though, which is that Ellie is working on the search for extraterrestrial life. I mentioned that we have this villain, David Drumlin. Well, what is his evil agenda? First, he doesn't think looking for aliens is a good use of taxpayer money. And second, he thinks that Ellie will have trouble publishing if she focuses on that. in both of those concerns, this guy is 100% correct. I'm not going to call SETI work completely unscientific. In fact, the Arecibo telescope was sometimes used for that in real life, although keep in mind that it fell apart a couple of years ago, and the NSF decided not to fix it up. I guess they never saw this movie. I like the storyline of a woman in science having to swim upstream a bit, but I think it's a shame that Contact couldn't find something worth fighting for, worth dreaming about within the realm of more legitimate science. I guess that would have been too boring. The movie contrives a big heart-warming story about following your convictions, dare I say, your dreams, coping with uncertainty, persevering through rejection and failure. It's the perfect film to inspire the next generation of girls to look for aliens. Actually, when I think of professional life and success in professional life, none of those virtues really come to mind. But still, it is inspiring. I just wish they were inspiring people to do something slightly different. Of course, this movie is based on a book by Carl Sagan, who was interested in seeing what a real contact event would be like, a real contact event, how the scientific world would react to this. And that's what we get. That's the focus of the movie, I guess. So maybe it's silly for me to say, well, I just wish that she was instead studying polymers or something. I think some of the reasoning in this movie about how this would all play out is interesting. What kind of messages the aliens would send to us, how would we try to decode them. That's kind of cool. I think the movie does a decent job at that. It's not particularly rigorous, but there's something there. It's kind of interesting. At its core, though, there's something slightly oxymoronic about this type of speculation. Science, of course, doesn't prove that aliens don't exist, but you won't find many scientists looking for them unless you're watching the History Channel. Like I said, this is kind of a movie for scientists and kind of the opposite. It has some well-thought-out ideas in it, but also some things that are impossible to take seriously. For instance, at one point, some Earthlings try to assemble something from plans sent by the aliens. To me, this seems like asking a caveman to build a computer and to expect it to work on the first try. Science fiction is always trying to balance two things, science and fiction. Obvious, perhaps. But that's actually pretty interesting because a lot of these sci-fi films are really honed in on the gadgets, the devices, the science of it in some ways, but of course, it's not true. And there's a balancing act there. To me, Contact doesn't quite get this balancing act right. Maybe it's a little bit too self-serious in some ways. I don't know. One of the big things in this movie is faith. Maybe you caught onto this already with the relationship between the scientist and the preacher. I like this theme, and the movie does more or less land in the right place, but man, it is so heavy-handed. This movie is almost 30 years old, and maybe the question of religion was on everybody's lips in 1997 when you talked about the space program and were quizzing astronauts in front of the Senate. You would ask them about God, maybe, but it feels more like The Miracle on 34th Street, really, a movie from 1947. Contact builds up a dichotomy between science and religion as if they couldn't possibly coexist. And again, it sort of resolves this in the end. It sort of lands in the right place, but the whole thing just smells so much of Richard Dawkins. Maybe Ellie's skepticism towards religion is a way to add some nuance to her character, but do you really think someone looking for aliens isn't going to be able to wrap their head around the notion of faith? It's actually sort of funny that Ellie's motto in this film, if we were the only people in the universe, wouldn't that be an awful waste of space? Something like that. Doesn't that kind of imply some sort of divine value system? It'd be an awful waste of space in the universe if it was only of us. It's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but maybe I would have expected Ellie to be talking about probability, to say something like it's a huge universe, and what are the odds that we are the only life forms that would have emerged, rather than wouldn't it be a shame if all of this was just for us? A shame for who? Maybe this is splitting hairs, but that seems to be pointing to something. I'm not even going to hold it against her that as a child, Ellie seemed to believe that her mother was still out there somewhere after her death. Anyway, like I said, I think the movie more or less lands in the right place at helping people to understand that scientific reasoning is not the end of the world, or let's say that scientific reasoning is not a complete picture of the universe or of knowledge. But it's not a very pleasant journey to get there, and it's not nearly as incisive as it could be. Let me touch on a few miscellaneous details. This movie briefly features the song One-Eyed, One-Horned, Flying Purple People Eater, of course, by Sheb Wooley. But did you know that Sheb Wooley was the guy who performed the Wilhelm scream? He was in a few legit movies like The Outlaw Josie Wales and High Noon, I think, and he was married to Roger Miller's cousin. This movie features a number of cameos by celebrities like Jay Leno. Basically, we just see how the world would react to aliens. This is yet another part of this movie that you think is kind of cool, and fresh, but when you think about it, you realize that almost every single movie about an alien invasion shows us some talking heads. Almost all the alien movies are actually quite a bit like this one. I guess they don't all get Jay Leno, though. There is a Rob Lowe cameo in this part, not as himself. I guess this stuff isn't too far off some of the historical clips you get in Forrest Gump, but those are maybe a bit more playful. One of the more bizarre parts of this movie is John Hurt's appearance as eccentric billionaire S.R. Haddon. This character would be more at home in a James Bond film, like as the villain. Haddon is coded sort of interestingly. He has an Asian assistant, and maybe it's slightly ethnically ambiguous. I don't know if you'd agree on that. You wonder if this is alluding to the Asian tigers phenomenon of the 1990s, and there's some anxiety surrounding that. I might be totally off, but it's a weird character. And it sort of presages today's billionaire space race, but it also feels really out of touch. In general, I think the acting in this movie is pretty good. Jodie Foster has to summon every ounce of her acting ability to seem like a nerd. Matthew McConaughey plays himself. James Wood is in this movie doing his usual thing. There are a couple times where I just wondered, have I seen this movie already? Didn't they make this one before? The production is pretty good. There's some cool effects, like the famous mirror shot. The opening sequence is cool. Are these anything more than gimmicks? Maybe a little bit more than gimmicks. I'm not sure. I'm complaining a bit here, but there are some positives too. Like, there are some moments of nuance. Drumlin's relationship with Ellie evolves in a way that you maybe wouldn't quite expect. The relationship between Ellie and Palmer also takes some turns. From the start. You assume that they're made for each other, but it's not quite that simple, partly because of this faith question. But it also seems like Ellie doesn't quite know how to open her heart. That's a subtle thing to get across, but I think the movie does a good job. Overall, Contact is doing a lot of different things. We've got the scientific nuts and bolts, romantic intrigue, nostalgia, politics, the religious angle, some other random themes, the weird billionaire subplot. We see a bit of a frenzy in the desert where thousands of like spectators and media flock to the satellite dishes, which not really even sure why you would center yourself around these dishes in the middle of nowhere, but it's almost as if someone got stuck in a cave and the media frenzy ensued. Anyway, I think you get the picture. There's a lot of different things going on. Is it spreading itself too thin? Maybe. Contact is pretty ambitious, but I guess it just can't quite escape from Hollywood. And ultimately, the story is trying to tell the themes they're trying to get across. They almost get there, but it also just loses something by being grafted onto the hero's journey. So that's Contact. I don't really know why I watched this movie because it's not exactly my kind of thing. What can I say, though? It's okay.